Hi, I'm Dillon, and you're listening to the Animals at Home podcast. Hey, thanks for joining me on this episode of the Animals at Home podcast. So today my guest is a fellow YouTuber and a skink breeder, as well as a former zookeeper. His name is TC Houston, and he runs the website as well as the YouTube channel reptilemountain.tv or .com. So we had a really interesting conversation, mostly revolving around the ethics of keeping and breeding reptiles. We talked about some of the, darker sides to our hobby, i.e. the side to our hobby that tends to maybe put money over the welfare of the animals or morphs over the welfare of the animals. So TC is a unique breeder because he has some fairly strict guidelines that he follows in his breeding practice as well as his selling practice. His guidelines are extremely appealing to me as someone who's very passionate about the welfare of the animals, and we both feel, I feel that people who are breeding or buying animals should really try to template or copy what TC is doing, because it is exactly what we should be doing if we want to maintain the privilege of keeping these animals. So if you're someone that is interested or thinking about potentially breeding some animals, I highly recommend this episode. I think this conversation will get you thinking about the right things and get your mind in the right place before you go ahead and bring a bunch of new beings into the world. These are the types of concepts you should be grappling with beforehand, and I think we cover a lot of them in the conversation. Enjoy. All right, well, TC, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Dillon. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, so I guess to give some people maybe a little bit of a background, we actually don't really know each other.
Nope.
But you had commented on one of my YouTube videos last week, and that YouTube video was, for those of you that are listening, I don't think you should keep reptiles as pets. That's the name of the video, and it's also the second episode of this podcast series. So if you haven't listened to that, you should go back and listen to it before you listen to the conversation that TC and I have today. But anyway, you commented on it, and I thought it was a really interesting conversation, and rather than going back and forth in the comments, I thought we could have this podcast and kind of get into a little bit deeper. So
yeah,
before we do that, do you want to just kind of give everybody a little bit of a background, who you are, kind of what got you into animals and sort of some of those, the experiences that you've had?
Yeah, sure. Like most kids or most folks, I started as a kid just loving wildlife. And when I was 5, my dad caught a garter snake and let me keep it as a pet. And then I've had reptiles in my life ever since. As a young guy, I really wanted to be a zookeeper. And so I went to school for zoology and then got a job, thankfully, as a zookeeper, professional AZA zookeeper, because the term zookeeper seems to be kind of broad these days.
Yeah.
If you work at a pet shop that doesn't that charges admission or something. Anyway, yeah, I was an AZA zookeeper at a major zoo and in Reptiles, and that was an honor and such a privilege. And so I just really loved that, but I chose to move to a different path in life and decided to keep a private collection of my own animals. And so now I breed Blue Tongue Skinks and a few other reptiles, and just recently decided to come out of not the closet, because that doesn't sound right, but come out from the basement, I guess, and be more public about my keeping, because I've always kind of been one of those lurkers, because I don't necessarily love some of the internet conversations, because I grew up before internet,
right.
before reptiles were on Facebook, before Facebook existed. So I'm used to that. But I just started Reptile Mountain just about 3 years ago to be a public face for my love, which are these awesome creatures. So that's kind of how that's my reptile life in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like the garter snake zoology zookeeper dream is almost like a template for a lot of people that are in this hobby. It's
totally.
I had the same experience. I caught garter snakes, and I was allowed to keep them in the garage. They weren't allowed in the house, but I didn't put a lid on the thing, and they escaped the next day, and I was totally bewildered how they got out. But now, obviously, owning snakes, I understand. But and then the same thing, I wanted to kind of study zoology, and I ended up going down a different path in school. But I feel like the zookeeper is like, if you have a kid who's very interested in animals or wildlife, there's two jobs that they might want. One is a vet and one is a zookeeper. And so you ended up going down the zookeeper path. And it was a real zookeeper, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it was fun. The only, when you're 5 years old, you don't see the zookeeper eating ramen noodles and living in a cardboard box.
Right.
But you just see them working with cool animals. And so once I grew up and learned a little bit about the struggles of working in the animal field, I had to leave it to sustain my snobbish lifestyle, I guess, whatever you want to say. But
yeah.
It's a great gig. And I didn't want to do vet because I noticed something when I was in high school. My vet, because I was going to be a vet, honestly. In high school, I was thinking pre-vet, and I went to my vet with one of my animals and said, I want to be a vet. And he said, you realize that you work with sick animals all day long.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? He's like, well, what do you think people bring healthy animals to me? And I go, no. Said, well, there you go. You work with sick animals all day long. Do you want to do that? Zookeeper it is.
Yeah. No, I had the same thing. I thought a vet would be really interesting, and you definitely forget that you're dealing with the worst stories all day. Like, I mean, obviously there's highlights to being a vet, but it's a sort of a different line of work for sure. So if there was one thing that you wish you knew before going into zookeeping, do you know what that would be?
Yeah, I actually, I had this, so you go to the zoo and you go look at each one of the animals that you like. And I'll be honest with you, like, there's some folks that get on and they're like, I love all animals. I like all animals. Like, I don't want them to be gone or anything. But I necessarily love all animals. So I go through a reptile house and I spend more time at the things I like, and I kind of peruse over the things I don't. As a zookeeper, I kind of walked in thinking, oh, well, I'm just going to pick every animal that I get to take care of, and y'all have whatever I don't want as the new guy. And that was wrong. So I needed to learn that they hand you the animals that you get to choose. And so sometimes there are less pleasant and less awesome animals in a zoo collection that that get assigned to you.
Right.
And so that was something I didn't have. I had some illusions of grandeur when I came in.
Yeah, definitely. That's actually something that I had never thought about before, but I guess, especially if you're the new guy there, you're taking care of what are some of the animals that you didn't like taking care of?
Well, it was more tedious. We had the zoo that I had was one of them was the major producer of Dumrell's boas.
Okay.
Before Dumrell's boas were like in every pet shop.
Mm-hmm.
We brought them in. And so, and in the zoo field, you can't sell them back to the private anymore. Or they stopped that in like 2003, where animals could go to private sector for the most part. So they had to stay in the zoo field or all zoos. And when zoos are full and you keep breeding them because you weren't paying attention, you got a lot. So I had like 50 Dumrell's boas in my section. And so it got like, and they aren't the kind that, they were well socialized and you handle them and, they're sweet. These were like, I'm going to bite your face off, Dumrell's boas. And so I spent hours getting bitten by Dumrell's boas just trying to change their water. And so, like, when I go to a pet shop and someone's so excited about their Dumrell's boas, I like bite my tongue and kind of just walk away.
Yeah. Just
not that they're amazing. They're amazing, but doggone it, I had too many of those.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. That's hilarious. So then after the zookeeping, you kind of went down a different path, and now you're in the hobbyist side to things, and
yes.
And so now you're skink breeder.
Yes.
So why skinks?
Well, the blue tongues are like this chunky little slow lizard. You can spook them and they can get a little fast, but it's not like a monitor where you're gonna need stitches or you're gonna bleed if they bite, which the skinks don't seem to bite at all anyway. They got that awesome blue tongue. And when I wanted to get into breeding, because I like everything, and I have this philosophy that if it's rare or limited resources in the wild or however it is, that I should at least pay it forward once by breeding whatever I have once, at least, so that it's not just me consuming, that I'm actually paying it forward for, my kids to have one in the future. And so I started doing it with blue tongues and realizing that they're a really awesome in between for a beginner person to keep. And so I wanted, if I was going to do anything on a bigger scale where I sell them and produce them for pets in a larger scale, I wanted to do something that would impact the hobby positively and something that could be captive bred easily, that's a good pet for someone who's never had a reptile, all the way up to folks that are experts in reptile care. And I found the blue tongue fits that niche really well. And that's why I dove really hard into that. I love Gilas. I was going to do Gilas. They have this little venomous thing going on, and that limits them being a great beginner pet. And so,
I wouldn't call those a beginner for sure.
No, I mean, wicked easy, but they'd get that venomous bite thing.
Yeah. I think that's probably one of the best ways to describe a blue tongue skink is just a great pet. And I've never owned a blue tongue, but anybody that has one loves them. Like they're like a little dog in the family. They seem to have a lot of character. They
do. They have such personality. Most of them are really personable. You can always have that occasional jerk, but really personable. They handle well. They eat readily, and they're hardy. You really have to screw up for one to not do well. Right. And that's great because that means that you can learn and the animal still thrives. Because, those delicate animals, it's hard to see someone try to start with like something like a Montane chameleon or something. And they're trying to dial it in. But while they're learning, the animal is kind of suffering a little bit, but not with skinks. That's why I like them so much.
Yeah, that definitely helps. So how big of an operation do you have? Like, I guess you just have it in your house, right? You just have a basement breeding type thing going on?
Yep. It's just a little, like, I'm a small time guy. I heard the term small batch recently, and I think it was with craft beer, but these are my craft skinks. And I have 24 adults breeding.
Okay.
Nothing huge. And I'm limiting that on purpose because I could fit 70 something with a different style setup, but I've chosen to do a little bit more elaborate for the animals, just because.
Yeah, well, I think there is a lot to be said, I think, about making sure that the breeding animals are not in a stressful environment when they're breeding. Like, you can make them breed in an environment that they're not going to be happy in, but who knows what kind of impact that has on their offspring and just down the line. So I think that's an interesting way to go about it for sure.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of is a good segue into kind of what we wanted to talk about today. And when I guess I'll sort of give you a background on my thoughts and sort of the ethical side of keeping the animals. Originally, a couple of years ago, when I ended up getting these two boas, and of course, once you kind of master the husbandry side of things, I feel like as a hobbyist, the next step is trying to breed. It's like an exciting, skill to acquire. It's like, oh, I'm just going to try to breed these snakes. But for me, which I really wanted to do, but the first question is, if you're going to breed snakes, what are you going to do with the offspring? And you basically have two choices. One is sell them, or two is be prepared to care for them. And with boa constrictors, you're dealing with like 20 or 30 babies. So I quickly found out that there was not a market where I live for boas. Like I saw litters taking years to sell, like 2 or 3 or 1 or 2 years to go through a whole litter to move them. And it wouldn't make sense for me to breed them. But that was kind of one of the more disappointing things that I found in the hobby, was that it seemed to me that a lot of people were not going through that thought process. They just either wanted to breed because they thought it was interesting, or wanted to breed because they wanted to make money, obviously not running the economics there. And then they create these animals, and then they have this problem like, oh my God, I have 25 boas and I sold 3 of them in the last 3 months and I'm, selling them for $50 a piece or something, but nobody wants them. So that's what kind of got, and then I took the next step and went into the ethics of keeping the individual animals rather than just the actual breeding of them. But I wondered if you could kind of break down on your website, you have your guidelines of operation. Yeah. And I thought they were great. Like, I mean, I think everybody should go read your guidelines of operation, and every breeder who's breeding should have something similar. Do you mind kind of breaking down kind of what those are?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, number one was that animal welfare comes first, second, and third. And so, with every decision I make, animal welfare has to be the first, second, and third line of decision making. So, if I want to do whatever, it has to be vetted through how's this going to impact my animals? How's it going to impact the offspring if I sell the animal? The whole 9 yards. And then, gosh, off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what's number two, but I believe most of them revolve around that I'm not going to sell wild collected animals as pets.
Mhm.
That I personally believe that that our natural resources can be better utilized through captive breeding, which obviously we all know all animals, if they were in captivity, they originated in the wild. But I don't think that they should be necessarily just little Johnny's pet. I don't like the idea of just harvesting from the wild. And so I made it clear that if I take a wild caught animal, my goal is to produce captive bred animals with that animal, and that they will never be sold as pets. Not for someone to just it to live its life out in captivity. Because in for me personally, a wild collected animal, and this is ecologically too, if you take it from the wild, it's worse than killing it and leaving it where it was. Because if you kill it, the body then produces a contribution to the ecology there in that environment. But if you remove the whole animal, including the body, you've not only taken away what it can produce for and what it eats and consumes and its part, but you've also taken away its actual body role in if it were to have died naturally. So it's actually worse to take it from the wild than to just shoot it in the wild, especially if you're just going to keep it in a box for our own pleasure and never use it to like stop the harvest and be more conservationist and preserve, or at least conserve, our resources. So that's another one. So no wildlife selling, no wild caught selling. um, I'm really strongly against the laundering of animals. That's a big problem these days. Some countries have these laws that prohibit the collection, and for whatever reason, whether you agree or disagree with them, they're there. And what happens is people will take those animals against the law and bring them to another country, either label them as captive bred or actually breed them and then sell them as captive bred offspring in that country and import them into the United States or Canada or Europe. And what that does, it's laundering of wildlife. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily the rules that I'm concerned with, but more animal welfare, going back to my number one. And smuggling these days, with the advancement in law enforcement, has caused smuggling to become bona fide animal abuse, like straight up abuse, inhumane treatment, where by admission, one smuggler says half of the animals die. And so there's no way that I'm going to support any laundering or smuggling. And I'm not going to be like, well, they're here, I might as well enjoy them. I'm
Mhm.
not going to even pay money, not even one drop, to anyone who does that, because it's supporting abuse. And I don't like that. And that's one of them. Let's see, gosh, a couple others
Well,
were,
those are, I mean, I
those
love
are,
all of those. And the other one that I remember off the top of my head when I was looking at it this morning was about the species hybridization.
oh yeah. Yeah. So like even the AZA and the ZAA, they all have a position statement against hybridization. I'm not a big fan of lab creations. Um, Maybe if it were for science and the animal was going to remain under care and never be introduced into the general population ever. But even then, you're kind of you're kind of playing with things that may never have happened in nature. For specifically with skinks, for us, there's the Australian animals, which Australia has limited export of their animals to zero, except for a specific zoo or two, since the 80s, actually, or late 70s. So any Australian animal that you get is captive born and bred in limited sources. And then there's the Indonesian species that are flying in off the shelves wild collected, and they do breed, but once you breed them together, they're two different habitats. They're two different genetic variable, genetic products. So you get a high humidity species with a low humidity species. You bred them together. What do the offspring? What's the welfare of that offspring? So are they going to be needing high humidity, moderate humidity, low humidity? Are they going to have the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds? They don't even represent a true natural animal, because there's no skink from Victoria, Australia, that's going to float on a log for that many miles all the way up to Indonesia and then, get frisky with another
Right.
skink. And that's just not going to happen. And there's a reason. I mean, speciation in evolution and in population genetics is a real thing for a reason. And so there's natural integrades, and I get that, but those are few and far between. Usually those animals aren't as successful. So I'm just very much against it because it can go into the hobby. Then Joe Schmo thinks he has a one thing and he doesn't, and then he breeds it, and we've diluted and kind of poisoned everyone's hard work.
Yeah,
And
I 100% agree. It's crazy how easily people hybridize when they're breeding. It's almost like they just don't care at all. And I mean, part of it I think is to do with the morph market has sort of established some of that. And then some of it is just like, I have these two animals that could breed, so I might as well breed them. And like you said, as soon as those animals come into existence, you can just guarantee as soon as those are sold to a private collector, their genetics is just a total crapshoot. Nobody knows what they are. The individual that's buying them is typically someone who's new to the hobby, and now they have a hybrid, and they might be calling it a boa constrictor, but it might be, a BCC or BCI cross or something. And forevermore, it's just going to be this bloodline of something that shouldn't have ever existed. So I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, it does. It's frustrating to see it, and it goes back to just breeder responsibility and integrity, and keepers too. So we have one obligation for the welfare of the individual breeding stock, but then we do, like you'd mentioned, we have a responsibility for the offspring, because we have in part created it, and there's we have not, because we exploded so fast. I say we, the reptile hobby, in part because of the ball python morph craze thing. It exploded so fast, and with technology, there wasn't enough of a foundation built behind responsible breeding. And so we've got folks that just see animals as money makers or as pretty toys and trinkets, which really, it doesn't play into a good, healthy community for the long term.
Yeah, it is very bizarre how that happened. And I think it almost seems like we have a lot of people in the hobby who are less passionate about the animals and more passionate about because breeding morphs is almost like a bit of, or I think of it as kind of like gambling, right? There's that like adrenaline rush that I imagine you must get cutting your ball python eggs, right? Oh my God, I got this, or I missed out on this clutch. And people become so obsessed with that. And the thing you don't see is the thousands of normal ball pythons that enter the market. And there's this very bizarre, it's almost like the breeders have never looked at how supply and demand works, because, you go back 15 years or whatever, and the ball python market was insane, or 10 years, it was just crazy. These animals are going for $10,000 an animal. And then you flood it by everybody trying to get in on it.
Right.
And not only are you left with way more animals than we need, you're left with a lot of these normal animals that nobody wants anymore, but it's just sort of the collateral damage of trying to breed morphs. So it's definitely an unfortunate, and I don't even know what necessarily the cure for that is, because the industrialized side to the breeding is something that's almost, people love it. It's like you're going to go buy your rack, you get your however many tubs you need, and then you're all set. And it's exciting for people to be part of that, rather than maybe we should be looking at it and thinking, what is this doing for the welfare of the animals?
Absolutely. It really reminds me of Ian Malcolm's quote in Jurassic Park, where the scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about the dinosaurs, and it's the same thing with the breeders. and I do believe there's some responsible ball python breeders, and I do know that people love those colors. And I gotta admit, when you look at some of them, you're like, wow, that
100%.
is amazing. And that's like a bedazzled snake. Amazing. Um, but at the same time, it's really kind of stressful to see when you go to like a show or something and you see just so many people, and then they see the prices and they think, well, I can have a pretty creature and they can produce money for me. Win-win.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there is a dark side to the breeding, and I don't know what the answer is either. I kind of have a feeling that it is going to eventually even itself out, because the corn snake morph market kind of hit its peak and has kind of gone down. I mean, the palmetto just went out with huge money, but now it's dropping quickly too. And I think it's going to settle down, but that doesn't. I guess that helps the future welfare of future ball pythons and other animals, but it may not be great for the ones that are now.
Yeah, I mean, the expectation that breeders should have is you're going into this for complete interest and hobby and not to make money. And maybe that would stop some people from, but you're right. People think that, oh, I'll just get these 2 snakes. It's just a business investment. Like they've never learned about business in their life. And all of a sudden they're these business people. I'll just take 2 snakes and they've never heard of overhead or like all these different things. And it kind of reminds me of a story. Last summer, I was walking around in the city that I live in, and there was this lady with a normal ball python around her neck. She was carrying it around. So I stopped and talked to her about a little bit. And I still remember like the quote that she roughly said was, yeah, he's got some really crazy genetics in him. So we're probably going to get another snake and then breed him and then just make a ton of money. And it was just like, it sounded like she bought this ball python yesterday and has never heard of anything. But that's where I think a lot of breeders actually start off from. They don't even understand how the genetics are passed.
Right.
You have all these, snakes that are carrying genes, and they don't understand how to create morphs. And like you said, not everybody's like that. And there are some people who are excellent breeders and are pulling out some really cool looking morphs, but it definitely creates this like offshoot of small time breeders who haven't done the research that impact the welfare of the animals.
Mm-hmm. And part, I think that as sellers and vendors and breeders, it's a responsibility to educate your customers,
Mm-hmm.
and to vet your customers. I vet my customers, and I hate to say it, but I keep a blacklist.
Mm-hmm.
I watch online what people say, do, how they act, and I don't go out and tell them, hey, you've made my blacklist. But if they're advocating for piss poor husbandry, or something that's maybe emotionally based as opposed to science, I will add them to the list with a little screenshot of what they said so I can remember. And then when it comes time to sell animals, I check that list before I approve a sale, simply to protect the animal from. And I think and it's tough, like you said. Sometimes you have 50 animals taking up food and draining your budget, and
Mm-hmm.
you're going to starve to death keeping these animals alive because you bred them and now you can't sell them. You get a little antsy and prices drop, and you start to compromise on who you'll sell to. And I think we have to be careful not to do that as a whole, as a hobby.
Yeah, well, I think that was one of the other things I was going to say about your guidelines of operation is when you read it, it's very obvious that your first step, besides the obvious fact that it says your first goal is the animal welfare, but when you read it, it doesn't seem like you're operating a business trying to make money. And that's what I was going to ask you about is you seem to support the people, like once they've purchased something from you, do they have an open dialogue with you once you've sold them an animal that they can ask you questions? And it kind of seemed like in one of those points that you make on your guidelines is that you're open to help them with their care.
Yeah, absolutely. I give lifetime support. So not their lifetime, but the animals.
Yeah.
Not going to help them through their
personal
hospice
stuff.
care when they're 99.
Yeah.
But I mean, who knows? I might if they're a nice person. But I actually will, for the life of the animal that I've sold them, I will be there to the best of my ability. And I believe that that's standard customer care. I believe that's important. I mean, the animal is alive because of what I did, in part. I mean, I'll give the mama skink all due credit.
Yeah.
But I did some of it, and it's my fault, if you will. And so anything that they need, I want to be there to support them. That's why I started my YouTube channel, was because typing all this up was getting ridiculous, and no one really wants to read. Well, I didn't want to read my own care sheet that long, so I decided to do videos to help folks in the community, but also mainly for my customers, because that's very important to do customer service and follow on care. It drives me nuts when you see someone on the forums who just bought an animal from Joe Schmo, the vendor at the expo, and they have no idea how to care for it, what it even is. The vendor didn't even know. I mean, that makes me want to slap the vendor.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you don't know what you're selling. Gee, what if the pharmacist did that? How'd that work out for them?
Yeah, it's weird. It's almost like this would never happen in it. Well, I don't know if it would never happen, but we're dealing with these wild, or not wild, but live sentient beings. And imagine if there was any other market where you were just buying and selling things that you didn't know what they were. It's like, I got this item, I have no clue what it is, but it's awesome. It for some reason in the animal world, it happens more than it definitely should, and it even seems to happen more so than in other markets in the world. It's very bizarre that, exactly like you're saying, people are buying and selling things that they have no idea what they are.
It baffles me, and I'm trying. So I've learned that we have to start with the beginners, because changing the veterans or some of the intermediate folks, they kind of start to get stuck in their ways, as I am, of course. We're all stubborn, but so I'm trying to catch the new folks to, if I can, help coach responsible thinking, responsible ethical breeding, responsible sales. Because just selling an animal because you don't know what it is, but it's pretty, and good luck. Here, Google this guy and see if he can tell you. That's irresponsible, and it's dangerous. And no wonder that, I mean, we have a real enemy in the animal keeping world that doesn't want us to have anything for pets anymore.
Exactly.
And lobbying heavily. And when we are just closing our eyes, spinning the wheel, and selling an animal for whatever price, and we don't even know what it is, we are giving them fuel. We're giving them fuel. And
exactly. Yeah. I
mean,
I think that's one thing that especially in this part of the world, we have a lot of privileges, and it is an absolute privilege to be able to own and work with exotic animals. Like, that's just no question. I can come home to my office and I have 5 species from across the world in this room. There's almost no reason for that, but it's a privilege, and we need to take the responsibility. And like you said, there's tons of people that don't know anything about these animals and just assume that they're dangerous and are lobbying to make it completely illegal to own, which I would hate, because I do think that there's a part of, and you've kind of alluded to it, almost like a Noah's Ark that we can create here with clean breeding and proper education to make sure that these animals don't disappear. But the lobbyists that are trying to get rid of them in the pet industry, like I said in that video, they just have to go onto the local classifieds and find tons of evidence that people don't know how to care for these animals. Exactly.
Which is where when your title of your video kind of, why you don't think they should be kept, like, that's immediately what drew me in to find out, because I wanted to know a little bit more about why you thought that, because I understand it's totally easy to see any classified, Craigslist or whatever, where the animal is mistreated. And we don't help ourselves by arguing or justifying something. We're looking the other way, especially with large, like massive imports and things of that nature, where 90% sometimes of some species die in the process.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
worth it.
Yeah, I mean, you can buy a wild caught animal for very cheap, but the question is, should you? And you shouldn't. And I mean, that was one of that, like I explained in that video, is as I went down the path of trying to give my animals the most natural experience, I kind of got hung up on the fact of, wow, should these animals even be in captivity? Like I am technically, pulling them out of the natural world, or I didn't physically do it, but
Right.
I'm part of the process of that, and I guess in a way perpetuating it. But then there's the other side of it, is there's the education side. So there is obviously a benefit to having these animals in captivity, right? We can you can learn from them.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say I don't think you can find a herpetologist or a zoologist that didn't have pets as a kid. I don't think you can find one. Maybe you can, but I would have to look pretty hard to find a herpetologist who didn't have a pet animal, or pet reptiles, or even keep some keep them now. And those individuals, those scientists, are contributing in massive scales to our knowledge as it is for the world, and doing some research. I mean, there's herpetologists doing venom research and helping cure diseases because they had a pet snake as a kid. And so obviously there is total education and contact benefit, but at the same time there's a way to get the benefit and maybe do it ethically. I believe that's what we want. I think that's what we both want.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that's part of the reason why I decided to make sure that I'm taking some of the, the ad revenue that I get and donating it to a charity that's actively protecting, the wild parts of the world that these animals come from, so I can feel like I'm at least contributing in some way. What do you think about in terms of enrichment for your animals? Do you think, because I think this is one of the areas that people tend to debate on, especially in the ball python industry, is where I think it's the most obvious, or at least that's where it seems to be the most prominent, is reptiles don't need really any enrichment. It's just as long as you have the hide and the water dish and newspaper substrate, that will be fine for them, because they're not capable of processing any more than that. And that's kind of one of the other things I had mentioned in the video, is making sure that we're caring for them. You don't have to create a bioactive enclosure, but you should be trying to care for them to the best of your ability. And I've been trying to find research papers, just academic peer-reviewed sources showing how enrichment affects animals, or reptiles specifically. And there does seem to be lots of evidence. I'm trying to work on a video or a paper just to review some of it, but there is lots of evidence to suggest that enrichment does help them. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sticky because people get confused on terms, and they jump 1, 2, 10 instead of 4, 5, 6 and all that, 3, 4, 5. So the reptile. So I did a couple videos about this, about emotions and anthropomorphism and enrichment. I have a video on enrichment as well, because I'm an advocate for enrichment. I believe that there is good evidence, peer-reviewed sources, that show that problem solving is something that reptiles are capable of at different levels based on species and evolutionary development. But problem solving is part of life, and so there is some cognition that these animals do think. There's not a lot, from what I've learned from my research, is that there's not evidence to show that they go the next step to cognitive appraisal, which means assigning value.
Yes, I totally agree.
And so when you assign value, then cognitive appraisal being the baseline for the formation of emotions. So, like, and when we hear the term enrichment, the average person is going to think happiness, or feels good, and yay, I'm all content. And you have to be careful, because that's not necessarily what it means. It's more like exercise for their brain. and because the brain is a function that they use in the wild, and there's clear evidence to show that enrichment does create a more skilled, stronger brain in an animal, and their brain then is able to problem solve better. And so I started thinking with my husbandry that it's important that I provide opportunities for them to use all the senses they are able to use. For example, my skinks, I had them in enclosures where they could burrow, and they had hides and they had rocks to climb around and things. And I actually would give them, I still give them this little cat toy, and I'll hide food in it so that they can try and figure out how to get it out. And some of them do, and some of them don't care. But I read a couple papers, and I realized that I didn't have anything green in my enclosure, and they can see color, and they can see green, and they see green in the wild. And so I was like, oh crap. So I went right out and got some fake plants, and real plants in Blue Tongue Skinks is a lot of work. So I didn't want to do that. Plus I can't keep real plants alive. Animals, fine. The plant kingdom, no.
Okay, plants are pretty hard.
They are. I don't understand. It's water, dirt, and light, and I can't.
God, leaves are falling off again.
I tell you, we had like a whole greenhouse at the zoo that we would just replenish as they died.
Yeah,
it was not us being awesome at horticulture. But anyway, I brought in greenery to their enclosure so that they could have that visual stimulation that would be natural. So as far as enrichment, I'm all for it. I know that they've shown some studies that show that snakes that give more enrichment, they are quicker to do problem solving than snakes that are just kind of kept in boring, plain environments that don't have a lot of stimulation. But I also have to remind folks that it's more like doing math problems than it is hanging out with your friends and family kind of feelings.
Totally. So, yeah. And I think I had read that paper as well. I can't remember what the species was. It rat snakes or
yeah,
something?
It was. Yeah.
Yeah. So that it's a really good point. And actually I had not thought about that, because on the emotion side of things, that is so far in my brain. I don't even think about the animals having emotion, but I definitely forget that a lot of people do think that. So when they think enrichment, they think emotion. And, one of the things I see on Facebook all the time, or forums, it's like, every time I walk past my snake's enclosure, it's so happy to see me. He comes out to the glass and he's like trying to get out. And and I think, okay, well, it's nice that you think that, but it's for sure, I would say that's not accurate. But on the enrichment side to things, it is, there's for sure. I mean, they have to survive in the wild. These are not domesticated creatures. Their brains are wired to problem solve 100% of the time.
Yep. And
if you put them in an environment where there's literally no problem solving taking place, I think you're 100% right. It's going to create, well, I mean, for lack of a better word, a dumber animal. Which, if you say, is that animal happy? I mean, we can't talk about happiness, but is it healthier? I guess probably not. It's probably not healthier because it's lacking a lot of environmental enrichment. I mean, one of the points I had made is, if you don't offer that stuff to your animals, you'll just assume they don't do that. It's like if you have the snake in a tub or an animal in a tub with a hide, and, well, I'm not going to add anything because all he does is sleep in his hide all day and all night. It's like, yeah, that's what he does because there's nothing else to do. There's no exploring. He like you said, he can't use his senses to investigate his environment and go, hunt or look for food and things like that. And you are going to get a boring animal if you have it in a boring setup.
Exactly. And, I can't remember what the cartoon was. There was like a cartoon movie where these people were living in a ship, and everything was done for them, and they were sitting in a chair. And when they fall out of the chair, they can't even move. They're like little blobs.
Oh yeah. Was that WALL-E?
Yeah, it was WALL-E.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like WALL-E, it's the same thing with our reptiles. If you atrophy their brain to an extent, yeah, they may not emotionally be upset about it, but is it right? Just like, is it right to let their muscles atrophy if they don't have to? They're not a peak physical and mental specimen unless you're stimulating their brains.
Yeah. And that's what I found amazing about owning these types of animals, is that it's like when you offer them those things, it's like a switch flicks in their brain and they immediately come to life. You know, you'll start seeing their naturalistic behaviors almost immediately. Like once they become comfortable in whatever you've done, change their enclosure, they just do whatever they would normally do in the wild. And that's what I think is really neat. And for sure, I think you can get away with an animal with an atrophied brain, just thinking that's all that they do. But I think if we're owning, like I said, we have the privilege to own these animals, I think we have to give them the most opportunity we can to at least develop properly.
Exactly. And I agree. And it's fun to see them investigate. Now I get it when folks overdo the enrichment, which you can, then you end up with stress. So there's like
Yeah.
a balance there, you know. So and it's not as hard as trying to give enrichment to like a dog or something, or a mammal. These guys aren't as smart. I mean, they're intelligent, but you know, just adding a new scent and hiding it, or changing their enclosure just enough that they have to refigure out where their hide is.
Yeah.
That's all you got to do. And it's relatively simple. And every time I clean my animals' enclosures, like I do a total change, obviously that's going to be some sort of stimulation. But I'll flip the hide to the other side and move the water bowl and the rock around, and maybe I'll switch rocks with something I've dunked in a cup of water outside that had a drop of watermelon scent or something, so that they smell this new thing, and it doesn't harm them at all, but it gives them something. And I think that's very easy to do without getting all touchy feely and thinking, oh, my animal wants to play with me because it loves me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I am not a handler. Like I don't really handle, I have two geckos. I don't handle them ever. And then my snakes, I handle them basically when I'm just cleaning their enclosures. So it's not very often.
Right.
And once in a while, I mean, there's nothing wrong with handling them, but like you said, they don't enjoy it. You know, it's not like they're slithering around or you're holding your skink and they're having a great time. It's for sure stimulation, but it might be a little bit more stressful than you think it is, because if they're just kind of sitting calmly there, it might not be a calming experience for them. So the enrichment, yeah, you're right. Inside the enclosure, making some small changes, just enough to keep that brain kind of firing.
Exactly. And that's hard to do for large breeders and large collections.
Yes, it's expensive.
And yeah, and time consuming, and unfortunate, and that causes some pushback. And I understand that, but maybe we could develop habits and do it that way, so that the folks, when they start off, they get used to, okay, well, I'm going to stir this up every day. And there's ways to do it without it being just avoided.
Yeah. It's almost that industrial complex that has allowed us to drift to like the clinical care, which is just like the most basics. And that's become the standard. And that's really unfortunate. That should be like lab standard if you're working with animals to study and you can't have any interaction with other things. But for hobbyists, it can't be that way. And I mean, there's one other thing that I was thinking about, and we'll kind of just maybe finish off on this, is the morphs. I mean, I guess with blue tongue skinks, there is some morphs, right? There's quite a few different morphs.
There are. Most of them are still in Australia or here laundered.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I imagine, are there any sort of like homozygous issue? Like, do you have any issues when you're breeding certain genetics together where you end up with an animal that is underdeveloped or can't thrive?
Well, not as bad, because they're not. We haven't bred them heavily here yet.
Right.
As far as go, there are occasional fatal mutations or fatal development issues with babies because of some lines and some line breeding, but it's not as prolific as in the ball python community. Usually, as soon as that happens, since there's such a small number of blue tongue skink breeders, we seem to know each other, and we'll just switch it around. And reputation for us seems to matter a lot more than money.
Right.
And so like, if I screw up and breed two animals that shouldn't have been bred and they have some wonky babies, last thing I want is those wonky babies getting my name because the other breeders will call me out. And
Totally, yeah.
and there's accountability there, and that's comforting. I think when it gets too big, if it were ever to get that big, there'd be some problems, because I think that's what happened with the ball pythons, is there's that lack of accountability in some circles, because it got so big that they could just breed, and I have an eyeless, lungless thing that's barely, that, and I'm just going to keep breeding because it's only 25% of my clutch. The rest are just rock star pretty and worth a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
At that point, they would get written off for me.
Well, totally. Yeah. I mean, and I have a theory about this that I haven't fully developed in my brain yet, but maybe I'll try right now. And one of the things I think is that the snake breeders, not just ball pythons, but mostly in ball pythons, like you said, they get away with these really faulty, poor genetic mutations because the animal doesn't have legs. Like a lot of the issues that you see are, you get like the spider wobble and sort of like balance things. And
right.
If you bred a skink that couldn't walk straight, or if we bred dogs that constantly like wobbled their head around and basically couldn't walk, everybody would feel terrible for it. You would feel so bad for the animal. You would make sure that would never get bred again, and you'd care for that individual until, it died. But it happens all the time where you have, oh, my snake, I have a spider, it has a spider wobble. It's like, if that thing had legs, it couldn't walk straight. So right. why are we breeding these things? So I think maybe with skinks or other, lizard species, they might stamp out like poor mutations sooner. And like you said, they haven't bred them enough to sort of pull out some of these recessive traits, but it would stamp them out sooner because, you're not going to sell an animal that can't walk.
Right. Right. And I know of a couple of breeders that they did have some issues, but it was believed to be kind of just a birth defect issue. But they definitely stopped just in case. They stopped, and with those animals that couldn't walk right, they gifted it to another breeder because it was super fancy, pretty, and they're caring for it. But yeah, exactly. I think because the wobble is way more evident in legged animals, and and I don't want to give ball python breeders like this super demonize them.
No, not at all.
Tons that are, I know you know this too, because there's tons that absolutely cherish their animals. They do enrichment. They breed with integrity. There's lots out there like that. Unfortunately, there's others that aren't, and those ones get more attention, which is too bad. But yeah, the genetics is tough because I struggle to like, I have one recessive mutation, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get to make hets and then get visuals again without inbreeding at all. And I'm pretty sure it can't happen. And I'm trying, but I want to. I want to will it to happen.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to breed it out to as far unrelated as possible.
Those Punnett squares aren't adding up properly.
No, I need another square in there. It's not working out.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's kind of what I was thinking. But anyway, I think we've had a pretty neat conversation, and maybe we'll start to wrap it up. If anybody, well, I guess if for one, anybody listening that's interested, if you ship across the states for your breeding operation.
Yeah, I can ship across the states, and I shipped once to Canada.
Oh, okay. Oh my God. Was that expensive for them to?
Yeah, that was a little like buying two skinks for one.
Yeah.
Price.
Well, I guess honestly, if anyone's listening and they're into skinks, check out TC's stuff. He obviously he cares about the animals he breeds, and I could see why someone would import one to Canada, because if they're looking for a high quality animal that they can trust the care from, TC would be the guy to get it from. So can you kind of let everybody know where they can find you?
Yeah. You can find me at www.reptilemountain.com, and that's my main website. And then over on Facebook at Reptile Mountain is my page. And then I have a YouTube channel, reptilemountain.tv.
Awesome. Okay, so if anyone's interested, definitely check his stuff out. He's got some really nice pictures on the website, as well as some great videos online on YouTube. So, well, thank you very much for joining us today, TC. I really appreciate it, and thanks for everybody for listening. Thought we had a great conversation.
Thanks, Dillon.
Thanks a lot for joining me today on today's episode. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And I think I want to make it clear that TC and I are not at all slamming ball python breeders at all. I think in this conversation, the ball python market is sort of the low-hanging fruit when we're talking about the ethics of breeding animals, just because the ball python market is so prominent. There's a lot of people doing it, which means if you have a lot of people doing it, you're going to have some people who are not doing a great job of it. And as we said, we know absolutely that there are some seriously great ball python breeders and also some really beautiful morphs that we can appreciate as animal lovers. And I think I can speak for both TC and myself when I say we are absolutely not discouraging you to start a breeding project. Actually, I think that's probably one of the more engaging things you can do with the hobby if you go about it the right way. If breeding is something that you think you might be interested in, I highly encourage you to sit down and really spend some time to think, what are the motivations behind me breeding? Because you have to remember, the output of your breeding operation is going to be real live creatures, and you are responsible for the beings that you create, and you're also somewhat responsible for the lives that those animals end up having to live. So take some time and ask yourself some of those tough questions, because I think when people start to go into the breeding side of things, and again, this is not just ball pythons, it's breeding of any animals, it's so exciting to do it, and I totally understand why it's exciting. But take some time, ask yourself those questions. Why do I want to breed? What is that motivation coming from? And if the motivation is just from a monetary side, or motivation is just coming from, I'm just curious to see if I can do it, and I'm curious to see what I would produce. Now, those are two okay reasons to breed, but they're definitely not the ultimate reasons to breed. Make sure you go look into the market that you live in. Is there a market for these animals? Can I be certain that I can place these animals into a home that they'll live good, healthy lives? And sometimes as breeders, I think people don't want to look at the market because they're more interested in the breeding aspect, and they kind of just want to see what they can create, and then they're left with offspring that they have to deal with. So I think I'll just leave you with some of the advice that TC gave us today, and that is that animal welfare comes first, second, and third. So if you use that framework to make every decision you make when it comes to breeding animals, you're going to be a great success, and you're going to add a lot of value to this hobby. All right, guys, thanks a lot for listening. We'll see you next time.